Check 1 2. Check 1 2 3 4 5. Yeah, I just need to put the battery on. Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. I'm gonna.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this joint hearing of the House Armed Services Committee on Strategic Forces and the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Terrorism, Trade, and Nonproliferation on Russian arms control cheating, violation of the INF Treaty, and the administration's response 1 year later. Testifying today are the following witnesses: the Honorable Rose Gottmiller, Undersecretary of State for International Security, Department of State; the Honorable Brian McCune, Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Department of Defense. This is an update to last year's hearing with these witnesses, and we're eager to learn what the administration has been doing since we met in open and closed sessions on this topic last December. Congress, as I promised last year, has not been sitting idle. The recently enacted FY16 NDAA included Section 1243, which directs the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to begin the research and development of military response options to Russia's violation. INF is, of course, not the only treaty or agreement that Russia is violating. We learned from Ms. Gottmiller during last year's hearing that on 8 of 12 treaties and agreements, Russia is not in compliance or is an outright violation of those obligations. INF has earned a lot of attention, but what are the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Open Skies Treaty? Are we less concerned about Russian chemical or biological weapons that can be used against the United States than intermediate range missiles that cannot? No, of course not. And this hearing is also the first opportunity for many members to ask the administration about the recent Russian disclosure of a nuclear-powered nuclear warhead that occurred during a review of Russia's nuclear forces that included its president, Vladimir Putin. According to the Russian translations of what was disclosed, this weapon would provide Russia with a new capability to damage, quote, the important components of the adversary's economy and coastal area and inflicting unacceptable damage to the country's territory by creating areas of wide radioactive contamination that would be unsustainable for military, economic, or other activity for long periods of time, close quote. What does that say about a country that feels that nuclear weapons are such a significant tool of its military and diplomatic strategy that discloses systems in this manner? And what does it say about a country that would invest resources in such a weapon? It's just nuts. Yet the only time the president talks about our president talks about nuclear weapons is when he wants to propose reducing them. The world's paying attention. We need our president to change his rhetoric. So we have a lot to talk about today. I'm looking forward to learning what the administration has been up to since this time last year. I'm looking forward to learning about the military assessment and review of military options that the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, produced, whether in the open hearing or the closed session. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Chairman Poe for any opening statement that he may have.
Thank the chairman. Last year, we held a hearing on this same topic in December of last year. It seems like it's Groundhog Day. Here we are again, and we all agree that Russia violated the treaty, but we're still talking about what the appropriate response should be. Russia is not someone that is our friend, our ally, and we certainly can't take them for their word. 2008, the same year Russia violated the INF Treaty and invaded a sovereign country, Georgia. I've been to Georgia. I've seen the Russian tanks on the hills. 7 years later, Russia still occupies a third of that nation. Last year, Putin was at it again. He told the world that Russian troops were not in Crimea while the world watched Russian tanks and little green men come into that area. Russia is now conducting strikes in Syria to prop up a dictator that has murdered thousands of Syrians. Putin seems to want to expand his empire, and the Russian bear is out of the cage, and it's time we recognize them for what they are doing. They are being aggressive. It's no surprise that Russia is once again breaking its word when it comes to a signed arms control treaty. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is a treaty between the United States which places limits on ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges up between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. The United States has held up our bargain. The Russians have not. Just according to press reports, it appears the Russians have tested a ground-launched cruise missile. They have responded that this is a sea-based missile, which does not fall under the treaty. That is nonsense. According to press releases also, the administration seems to have known about the violations back in 2008. It took 3 years for the administration to report concern about the Russian compliance in Congress. It took 6 years for the State Department to officially find the Russians in violation. And this year, the State Department repeated its findings that the Russians are in violation of the treaty. Chairman Rogers and I have made several attempts to the State Department, appeals to the State Department and Department of Defense about this issue. Candidly, the responses we've gotten back lead me to believe that we're not taking the issue as seriously as we should. We have so far made no substantial progress in bringing the Russians back into compliance. After 7 years, there have been no consequences for the violation of the treaty. We've told the Russians our concerns, and their response, the Russians deny they're violating the treaty. What I'd like to know is what I asked last year. What are the next steps? How are we going to convince the Russians that we do mean business, if we do mean business? What's the administration going to do to hold the Russians' feet to the fire and hold them accountable? There are some who want to go easy on the Russians in that they want to ignore this situation. I don't think that that is an appropriate response the United States should have toward the Russians and the stockpiling of these violations. So I look forward to what the witnesses have to say, to be upfront, candid, blunt about what is the strategy, what are we doing, what is the United States and our allies doing. And then we have the problem of two rogue nations already developing very similar weapons that we and the Russians have supposedly agreed not to develop, and that would be Iran and Pakistan developing similar weapons. So what is the United States response going to be, and what do we plan to do about it? And I will yield back to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes my friend and colleague from Tennessee, the ranking member of the Strat Forces Subcommittee, Mr. Cooper, for any statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we would all like to welcome our colleagues from the Foreign Affairs Committee. We hope that they will treat us kindly at the next NDAA when it comes to sequential referrals or any issues like that, but you're always welcome in the Armed Services Committee room. I also hope that our friends from Foreign Affairs can join us in the classified session to follow this hearing. In fact, it would be good if this public portion were kept as short as possible so that we can learn as much as possible in the classified session. Everyone knows that Mr. Putin doesn't conduct his business in public, and why give him an advantage by displaying our deliberations. We have before us today two very distinguished public servants. I look forward to hearing their testimony, and I also hope that our colleagues will bear in mind that international relations are not black and white, particularly when it comes to Russia. And I know that our chairman is very sensitive to the issue of the RD-180 rockets, which unfortunately we depend on quite heavily for U.S. assured access to space. And it's kind of an amazing thing. Throughout the perils of the Cold War, we've always had a pretty reliable supply of those rockets. So nothing is black or white. No one is defending Mr. Putin. We know that they cheat. We're outraged by their takeover of Crimea, the invasion of Ukraine, the bombing of anti-Assad forces in Syria. But it's very important that really the meat of this hearing be held in the classified session that will be upcoming. So I look forward to seeing all of my colleagues upstairs in a few minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, for any opening statement he may have.
Well, thank you, Chairman Rogers and Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Cooper, for conducting this timely hearing. I also like to thank our two witnesses for being here today to discuss Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, both in this hearing and later on in the classified briefing to follow. I understand that there are limited to what you can say and disclose in this setting, but I appreciate the opportunity to discuss publicly the issue of Russia's compliance with the INF Treaty, something I think that's important for the public to know, but not necessarily details that will advantage the Russians. 28 years after the INF Treaty was signed, it remains one of the most important nuclear treaties that the United States has ever signed with Russia. The State Department and numerous observers have stated that Russia has developed, produced, and flight-tested a ground-launched cruise missile in clear violation of the INF Treaty. A Russian violation of the INF Treaty, as with a violation of any treaty, would be a serious matter. I look forward to further details regarding the particular Russian weapon system at issue and a discussion of what its deployment would mean for Russia in terms of its military strategy and how it would impact the security in Europe and in Asia, importantly. If Russia is found non-compliant with the treaty, the United States, in conjunction with our allies, should use all the tools at our disposal to pressure the Russians into ending these offending activities. While the question of noncompliance by Russia must squarely and seriously be dealt with, it's critical that the United States, for the time being, continue to observe the treaty. A withdrawal would only free Russia to legally pursue testing and deployment of intermediate-range missiles that currently violate the terms of the treaty. I look forward to hearing from our panel this afternoon on the threat posed by Russian development, production, and testing of intermediate-range cruise missiles, Russia's intention with respect to the INF Treaty, and importantly, U.S. responses. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Ms. Gottmiller for 5 minutes to summarize your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Poe, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Members Keating and Cooper, and distinguished members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and Armed Services Committee. Thank you for hosting this hearing and for having me here today. This subject is one on which I previously briefed these same committees, including last year at around this time, as was already indicated. To permit time for a good discussion today, with your permission, I would like to abbreviate my remarks and submit my full testimony for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, sir. Let me begin by saying that the United States does not undertake arms control and disarmament as an end to itself, nor do we look at arms control and disarmament in isolation from deterrence and the general strategic environment, including the changing security environment in Europe. Together, arms control and deterrence help to create the conditions for a more durable and predictable form of strategic stability. Therefore, together, they benefit U.S. national security. Arms control frameworks are one available and important instrument in our foreign policy toolkit to advance global stability and the security of the United States, our allies, and our partners. This has been true for over 4 decades for both Republican and Democratic administrations for a wide variety of nuclear and conventional security issues of concern. We have worked closely with our allies and our partners to develop the arms control framework that we have today, and both we and our allies and partners continue to see enormous value in these agreements. Over the last 3 decades, there have been compliance and implementation issues with first the Soviets and then the Russians on a variety of agreements. Former officials of both Republican and Democratic administrations and their colleagues in Congress were forced to grapple with many of the same problems we face today. How do we resolve violations when faced by blatant denials? How do we work with allies and partners on these challenges to ensure a unified and proportionate response? These are not easy questions to answer. This is not easy work to accomplish. Let me assure these committees once again that the administration takes compliance with all arms control agreements extremely seriously. For this reason, this administration worked hard to produce a compliance report in July of 2010, the first delivered to Congress after a 5-year lapse, and has produced one every year since, as required by statute. The focus of today's hearing is Russia's violation of the INF Treaty, so I would like to focus my remaining remarks on that important topic. As a first comment, and in response to some of our opening comments, I just wanted to say that we had no information or indication in 2008 that the Russian Federation was violating the treaty. That information emerged in 2011, and I know we'll want to discuss this more during the hearing and also in our closed session, but I did want to put that out right at the beginning. In May of this year, in the unclassified portion of the annual compliance report, the United States repeated its determination that Russia is in violation of its INF treaty obligations. Since 2013, we have raised with Russia our serious concerns regarding conduct that we ultimately determined to be a violation of the INF treaty, and have held senior level and technical level bilateral discussions with the aim of returning Russia to verifiable compliance with its treaty obligations. Throughout the course of this year, We have raised this issue with Russian officials on repeated occasions and at various levels and in various departments within the Russian government in order to resolve U.S. concerns. We have made very clear that this is not a technicality, a one-off event, or a case of mistaken identity. Again, it was mentioned the notion of this being a sea-launched cruise missile. However, this is a serious Russian violation of one of the most basic obligations under the INF Treaty. While the United States is engaging diplomatically with Russia, as noted above, we have devoted a great deal of attention in 2015 to consulting with our allies and partners in the interest of pursuing a coordinated response to the Russian violation. Our allies have made clear their interest in preserving the INF Treaty and their continued wish that the United States remain in the treaty and seek to bring the Russian Federation back into compliance. Russia continues to be unwilling to acknowledge its violation or address our concerns. We have shared more than enough information with Russian officials for them to look through their own records and identify the relevant program. Their denials and counter-accusations clearly attempt to deflect attention from their own violation. Therefore, we continue to work closely with allies on a series of diplomatic, economic, and military measures to protect the interests of the United States and our allies. And I know that my colleague, Mr. McEwen, will want to say more about the military aspects of this. I assure this committee that the Obama administration is committed to bringing Russia back into compliance with the INF Treaty. While our public determination and diplomacy has yet to lead to Russia returning to compliance, our announcement of Russia's violation and reaffirmation of continued U.S. commitment to the treaty has imposed significant costs on Russia. Its covert Glickam program has been exposed, and Moscow is not free to pursue this effort unconstrained, as this would confirm for the world that Russia has been violating an agreement that has been a key instrument of stability and security for nearly 3 decades. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chair, and I recognize Mr. McEwen for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Rogers, Chairman Poe, members of the committee, appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. I will not belabor the point that you already know, and which Under Secretary Guttemauer has already discussed, that the Russian Federation is in violation of its obligations under the INF Treaty. Since making this determination, our objective has been to preserve the viability of the treaty by convincing Russia to come back into compliance. We believe it is in our national security interests and our allies' interests that the treaty remain in force and that Russia remain a state party to the treaty and complies with its obligations. This means that Russia must cease its non-compliant activity and eliminate all INF Treaty-prohibited missiles and launchers in a verifiable manner. Equally important, our approach is focused on ensuring that Russia gains no significant military advantage from its violation. Doing so will ensure that our efforts to bring Russia back into compliance will not come at the expense of our security or that of our friends and allies. As a result of Russia's actions, in 2014, the Joint Staff conducted a military assessment of the threat posed by Russia if it were to deploy an INF Treaty-prohibited ground-launched cruise missile in Europe or the Asia-Pacific. This assessment tells us that the deployment of such a system would increase the risk to our allies and pose an indirect threat to the United States. My Joint Staff colleague can address this in more detail in the closed session. This assessment led us to review a broad range of military response options and to consider the effect of each option would have on convincing the Russian leadership to return to compliance with the treaty and on countering the capability of a Russian INF Treaty-prohibited system. This assessment has occurred at the same time we are confronting a new strategic reality in Europe, a Russia that is modernizing its military capabilities, a Russia that has destabilized the European security order by purporting to annex Crimea, and a Russia that is actively seeking to undermine NATO. Finally, Moscow's nuclear saber-rattling has raised questions about Russia's commitment to strategic stability. In light of this new strategic reality, the administration determined that we needed to consider Russian actions with regard to the INF Treaty in the context of its overall aggressive and bellicose behavior that flouts international legal norms and destabilizes the European security order. Russia is not violating the INF Treaty in isolation from its overall aggressive behavior. Therefore, we concluded that our responses cannot focus solely on the INF Treaty. Stated another way, this is not just an arms control issue, but it represents a broader challenge to transatlantic security. Accordingly, we are developing a comprehensive response to Russian military actions and are committing to investments now that we will make irrespective of Russia's decisions to return to compliance with the INF Treaty. And while we do not seek to make Russia an enemy, and we will cooperate with Russia where it is in our interest to do so, such as in the P5+1 negotiations with Iran, the President has made clear that we will uphold our Article 5 obligation under the North Atlantic Treaty. Our core objective remains the same, to ensure that Russia does not obtain a significant military advantage from its INF violation. We believe that our overall efforts to prepare for the defense of Europe can achieve this goal and ensure that the INF violations do not leave Russia with any appreciable advantage over us or our allies. As we consider the changed strategic environment in Europe, we are factoring Russia's increased cruise missile capabilities, including its INF violation, into our planning. Our responses to Russia's activities in Ukraine, as well as the complex security challenges in the south of Europe, involve a broad range of efforts within the Department, bilaterally with allies and partners, and within the NATO alliance. First, we have focused on posture and presence. In the last year, under the European Reassurance Initiative, for which Congress generously provided nearly $1 billion in fiscal 15, we have maintained a persistent rotational air, land, and sea presence of U.S. forces in the Baltics and Central Europe to reassure our allies and build up their capacity. We are also transforming our posture in Europe to be more responsive and sustainable for the 21st century. American rotational forces need to move more quickly and easily to participate in training and exercises in Europe. That's why we are pre-positioning tanks, artillery, infantry fighting vehicles, and other equipment to rapidly respond to crises and provocation. 6 states in Europe, the 3 Baltic states plus Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, have agreed to host company-to-battalion-sized elements of this equipment, which will be moved around the region for training and exercises. Second, the United States and the alliance are focused anew on planning and shaping our future military activities in Europe. We have energized planning and resourcing efforts in response to the changed security environment in and around Europe. Third, we are working to improve our defensive measures to deny Russian offensive capabilities by modifying and expanding air defense systems, including addressing the difficult challenge posed by cruise missiles. As Secretary Carter stated in a recent speech, we are investing in the technologies that would be most relevant to Russia's provocations, developing new unmanned systems, a long-range bomber, a new long-range standoff cruise missile, and a number of innovative technologies. Fourth, we are leading the alliance to prepare for the new challenges posed by Russia and the instability and terrorism in the south of Europe. We are working to implement agreements made at the Wales Summit and to plan for the next summit of leaders in Warsaw next July. NATO has reorganized the NATO Response Force, set up a new command centers, and established the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force. We are pressing our allies to fulfill the commitment made at Wales to invest more in defense, with a particular focus on new capabilities. We continue to look for ways to improve alliance capabilities and decision-making. With regard to NATO's nuclear deterrence mission, allies remain strongly committed to burden sharing as a foundational element of NATO's deterrence and defense posture. Our dual-capable F-35A is on track and should be complete operational testing of its dual capability in 2024. The B-6112 nuclear gravity bomb life extension program, a critical element of both our NATO commitment and our strategic forces, is on schedule and on budget to meet a March 2020 first production unit goal. In confronting this challenge, we will take a strong and balanced approach. We will not go back to the old Cold War playbook of having hundreds of thousands of forces in Europe. We are also mindful that we do not need to, nor should we, return to a world where we match every Russian action with a direct and mirror-imaged reaction. We will use a smaller footprint, high-impact rotational presence, build partner capacity, and integrate planning between space, cyber, conventional, and nuclear forces. In sum, we will take the necessary steps to build U.S. and NATO capabilities, posture, and plans to deter Russia's destabilizing influence, coercion, and aggressive actions, all while keeping the door open for cooperation when and if Russia is willing. These efforts will require expenditures we were not planning to make, and which will be challenging under a constrained budget. But make no mistake, we will undertake these efforts. Our security and that of our NATO allies requires an effective response and comprehensive strategy. Let me conclude by reiterating that the pursuit of strategic stability remains in the interest of both the United States and Russia, and we hope Russia will remember why the Soviet Union signed the treaty in the first place. By agreeing to the treaty, the United States and the Soviet Union ensured that both parties benefited from the removal of weapon systems that posed a real and credible threat to regional and international security. We appreciate the attention of the Congress to these issues, and we will keep you informed of developments. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
I thank both the witnesses, and I'll recognize myself now for the first series of questions. Ms. Gottmil, I was just listening to your opening statement, and you made the point that you didn't realize that Russia was violating the INF Treaty until 2011. I'm looking at an interview you did with the Denver Post 2 weeks ago on the 13th. It was published of November, and you stated, Russia tested starting in 2008 a ground-launched cruise missile that flies to ranges banned by the treaty, and then you go and explain what a ban means. If you didn't know until 2011, how do we reconcile that statement in the Denver Post with what you testified a few minutes ago?
Sir, we saw that they were starting to test a cruise missile during that time period. But this is, a situation where it was only over time did we accumulate the information that it was a ground-launched cruise missile. So the testing series, and again, this is something we can talk about in more detail, the testing series did begin in 2008, but it was only later in that time period did we see that it was a ground-launched cruise missile. So I was not aware of how the Denver Post had put that information together, but that was not correct in the way they quoted the information.
Okay. But you do recognize that disparity, and it raises concerns for me that it took us 3 years. If we knew they started testing in 2008, it took 3 years for us to realize that they were violating the ranges that were permitted under the INF Treaty.
It's worth bearing down on this point for a moment, sir, because under the INF Treaty, sea-launched cruise missiles and air-launched cruise missiles are permitted, and there is no reason why the Russians could not have been developing during that period a new sea-launched or air-launched cruise missile. We simply did not know until later in the test series that it was a ground-launched system.
Was any of that data shared with the Senate during the 2010 hearings on the New START Treaty?
Sir, we did not understand at that point of time, and again, I'd like to talk about this further in our closed session along with some of our colleagues, but we did not know that it was not a sea-launched or air-launched system and completely in accord with the INF Treaty.
Okay. This question be for either one of you. We were told last year in our hearing on this topic that there were a range of responses that had been prepared and were ready for consideration by at the principal level. And this committee then wrote, these joint committees, then wrote a letter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs urging action on those range of responses. And I will introduce that letter for the record. Did the principals ever meet to consider those responses? If so, when and what did they decide? If not, why not?
I'll start. I will say that we have had a series of interagency meetings on this matter up to the senior level of principals, so it hasn't been a single event by any means, and I will turn to Mr. McEwen to pick up on what's next.
Mr. Chairman, some of the things I described in my opening statement are decisions and responses that we are undertaking. I can say more in closed sessions about a couple of specific matters that involve the NATO alliance that are also decisions of the government.
Okay. Well, I won't belabor that in open session because I do want to pursue it in closed session, and my guess is you're going to tell me you couldn't say it anyway. So, but I am interested in knowing exactly how you're proceeding and when you're going to proceed, and if we need to do any reprogramming in FY16 or 17 to accommodate those measures.
Well, part of what I should underscore, Mr. Chairman, from my opening statement is, as we looked at the INF issue, we were also confronting the broader Russia challenge and how to respond to it, and didn't think it was appropriate to respond just specifically to the possibility of a new ground-launched cruise missile in Europe, but a broader challenge to European security. So many of the things I outlined are part of a response to broader Russian behavior, including the INF violation.
See, that's my fear, is that this set of responses that have been prepared a year ago for consideration are now going to just blend into the new challenges that we have to face, and we're going to get no action on the violations of the INF Treaty. That is a long-standing violation that needs an appropriate response by this nation, and it should not be impeded or blended in to any other concerns that we're having with Russia's new activity. Let me ask this, Ms. Gottmiller, is it in America's interest to continue to unilaterally comply with the INF and these other treaties when Russia is not doing so?
Sir, we judge this treaty to be in our national security interests. And I should say, sir, that this is not a bilateral treaty. All of the successor states of the Soviet Union are also signatories of this treaty. So it is a significant treaty sustaining stability in Eurasia, we judge, and our partners and allies in Asia and in Europe judge it to be in their national security interests as well. So I will say that, and by the way, we judge that Russia in some ways has had itself brought up short by our calling them out on this violation of the treaty. And
I'd
so,
love to know how.
well, they have been saying quite regularly and publicly that they are in compliance with the INF Treaty, which we don't buy, but also that they are not preparing to withdraw from the treaty, which I think is a good thing because it allows us to continue to drive forward, pursuing them diplomatically as well as with other responses and countermeasures.
I don't know why they want to withdraw. They're not having to comply with it anyway. I mean, they don't have any pressure on them. We're the only ones that are in compliance, and I just think it's foolhardy. But with that, I'll stop and turn to the Chairman Poe.
But I agree with the chairman's comments about we are the only ones complying. Let's talk about the specific type of missiles in a broader scale. The United States and Russia and the former Soviet republics have agreed to limit the number of missiles. Is that correct?
Yes, that is.
However, there are other countries that are pursuing these very specific types of missiles, such as Iran, Pakistan, North Korea, China, possibly. So, to your knowledge, either one of you, are those four countries and maybe others pursuing the development of these very types of missiles?
It's common knowledge, sir, and indeed the Russians have said publicly that there are other countries developing intermediate range nuclear and ballistic and cruise missiles. So they do talk about that publicly as being a reason why they have a debate going on in the Russian Federation today about the treaty.
It's not a gotcha question. I'm just looking at the global situation. The United States has said, we're going to do this, we're going to limit the number of missiles we have. We're working with the Russians and the former Soviet republics. We all agree we're going to limit. But out there in the world, you've got probably some rogue countries like North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, and then you have the Chinese who are not bound by this treaty or any other treaty to limit these types of missiles. Is that a concern of the United States?
Let me recollect for just a moment, and then I'll turn to Mr. McEwen for what he'd like to add, but say for just a moment that it's useful to remember the reason we entered into this treaty in the first place back in 1988. That is that these types of missiles represent a very short flight time to target, and therefore they do pose a threat of short warning attacks on important targets. That's a very great concern for our allies in both Europe and Asia, and for that reason we continue to believe that it's important to sustain this ban on the treaty with regard to the Russian Federation. Now, I will note that we have other means of responding to intermediate range nuclear missiles being developed elsewhere, or conventional missiles for that matter, and I'll turn to Mr. McEwen now.
Well, I don't know if I understood your answer. Does that concern us that these types of missiles, North Korea could send them to South Korea, Pakistan could send them to India, China could send them to Russia? I mean, there's all different scenarios on the short range capability of these missiles. Does that fact alone concern us as a nation? Mr. McEwen, you can answer it.
Mr. Chairman, if I could first address part of your question, which is the INF Treaty only bans a type of missile, a ground-launched cruise missile and associated launcher. It doesn't ban the number of other types of missiles, and we have an ample supply of sea-launched and air-launched conventional cruise missiles in our inventory. So we're not limited in any respect from those capabilities. As Undersecretary Gadamer said, Iran has a missile program which we're quite concerned about, medium-range program that they've engaged in some testing, and they have ambitions for a longer-range system. That's part of the reason for the European phased adaptive approach to missile defense in Europe, which is progressing. We are concerned about North Korea's missile program. There's no question about that. It's why we made some of the investments we've made in the homeland missile defense in the last few years.
I'm not suggesting that we should get out of the treaty. I'm just suggesting that we are bound by a treaty to limit certain types of missiles. Russia is the only other country, and the former Soviet republics are the only other entities that are bound by this. Other nations are not. That was my question. And does that concern us as a nation?
Sir, as a matter of our ability to protect the United States and our allies, as I noted in the statement, the Russian capability does pose a threat, but it continues to be our view in the department that we have sufficient capability to meet our defense requirements at present.
How about our allies, like South Korea?
Our work with our allies in South Korea is an ongoing, continuing project. They are doing well in investing. We are having conversations with them about certain capabilities, and they're worried more about short-range missiles, not any medium-range missiles that exist, and wouldn't, even if this treaty applied to the Koreans, wouldn't affect a short-range system.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Cooper for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gottmuller, I believe in your testimony you said that there was a 5-year lapse in reporting that the State Department had to Congress. There was no reports between 2005 and 2010, but then reporting was resumed.
Yes, sir, that is correct. I will underscore that the so-called annual compliance report is an interagency effort. It's not just the Department of State that carries it out, although the Department of State is responsible for leading the effort. But there was a period between 2005 and 2010 when it was not published on an annual basis.
Mm-hmm. But since 2010, the reports have been made annually.
Yes, that is correct.
Mm-hmm. The Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty is of primary benefit to our allies, for example, in NATO and in Asia. What is their reaction from your diplomatic experience? Do they want us to stay members of this treaty? Are they urging Russian compliance? What's their general attitude?
Sir, they have been very keen to ensure that the INF Treaty remains in force. They've been very keen to see Russia re-enter into full compliance with the INF Treaty, and they have really been very eager to work with us in this regard.
Mm-hmm. Can you refresh my memory, since you've been on duty at the State Department, how many times you've briefed Congress or informed us of what's going on in this area? Because I think some of my colleagues have the mistaken impression that we've been uninformed on these issues, and I think it's a number of times. Could you refresh my memory on that?
Sir, we went back and looked it over. In my experience, we have not briefed any issue more than we have briefed this particular issue. And it's not only me alone, but a number of colleagues at both the political and expert level, and the number of briefings, hearings, and meetings amounts to about 60.
60, like 6-0?
Correct.
Well, that's quite a number. And there are many disturbing Russian activities, as my colleagues have pointed out. So for this issue to have received disproportionate attention would seem to indicate that Ukraine, Syria, Crimea, other issues such as Russian military doctrine talking about escalatory dominance, the preemptive use of nuclear weapons, that would be a topic nuclear related that we should perhaps give as much attention to as this.
Sir, there are many troubling issues with the Russian Federation right now, and this is among a number of very troubling issues. I'll only say that.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time. Look forward to the classified session.
Thank the gentleman. I would agree this issue has received a lot of talk. Unfortunately, it's received no action. Chair now recognizes Mr. Keating for any questions he may have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Curious how much you could comment on the fact that, in my view, Russia has an enormous a stockpile of strategic and other nuclear weapons already. And I'm just trying to think of a real good reason why this is so strategically important to them. I'm just curious what your thinking might be. What are Russia's real gains doing this, given their stockpile and the other assets that they have at their disposal already?
It's a very good point, Mr. Keating, that all of the potential targets around the Eurasian periphery for intermediate range, either cruise or ballistic systems, could be handled by their central strategic forces. The Russians have also been developing very capable cruise missiles, both air-launched and sea-launched. So to be honest with you, sir, we're puzzled as to why they think they need a ground-launched cruise missile that is in violation of this important treaty, because we see they have, in our view, adequate capabilities to cover these threats with other systems at their disposal, and that are entirely in accord with the INF Treaty.
Yeah. Do you see any, in terms of Asia, in terms of Japan, South Korea, China, are they worried at all that, those countries are advancing somehow and getting a strategic edge? Is that part of what their thinking might be? I know you're asking to get yourself inside Putin's head. We've had many hearings trying to do that with little success.
I can only say, sir, following on my earlier answer, Mr. Putin himself said in public last August that he is concerned about the emergence of intermediate range systems, missile systems in China, in India and Pakistan, and in Iran. So, I understand that there is that concern that has been perhaps present in the Kremlin, in Moscow, but I'm only really speculating and based on what he had to say publicly.
And then it's very tricky, especially at a hearing, dealing with verification issues, but it's clear that the evidence is there. They can deny it and then seek more information. And doing so, we might be giving our sources and means of intelligence that we don't want to give to them indirectly. But, looking at things, has there been discussion to set up an Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty Special Verification Commission as provided for in the INF Treaty? Has that been a source of discussion?
Mr. Keating, if we had some inkling that the Russians would acknowledge this missile and would engage productively in an SVC discussion to try to resolve these concerns, we would be happy to convene an SVC session. Recognizing the complexities I mentioned earlier, saying that this is a multilateral treaty with a number of countries who are now members of the treaty from across the former Soviet Union. But nevertheless, if we had some inkling that it would help, we would be delighted to convene an SVC session.
Well, that leads us to the issue of responses, which I'm afraid is going to really be a subject matter in the classified setting. So I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Oklahoma. The gentleman from Oklahoma. I've got too many people talking to me up here. Mr. Bridenstine. Sorry about the Nebraska comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just had a question. Of course, the INF violation is of high importance to everybody here, but I think it's emblematic of many larger issues that I think this committee is bringing up, and I think appropriately so. One is a question that I have about the Open Skies Treaty. Admiral Haney, commander of U.S. Strategic Command, stated, quote, "The treaty has become a critical component of Russia's intelligence collection capability directed at the United States. In addition to overflying military installations, Russian open skies flights can overfly and collect on DoD and national security or national critical infrastructure. The vulnerabilities exposed by exploitation of this data and costs of mitigation are increasingly difficult to characterize," unquote. Do you agree with Admiral Haney that Russia can use open skies to surveil national critical infrastructure? Ms. Gottmeiler?
Sir, the Open Skies Treaty is designed, in fact, for overflight of other territory. We overfly the Russian Federation in the same way. In fact, we find it quite useful to overfly their rail lines, for example. I wanted to stress that one of the advantages of the Open Skies Treaty is that information, imagery that is taken is shared openly among all the treaty parties. So one of the advantages with the Open Skies Treaty is that we know exactly what the Russians are imaging because they must share the imagery with us. So that is an advantage over the so-called national technical means of the Russian Federation, where we're not sure exactly what they are imaging.
So are they imaging national critical infrastructure that has nothing to do with defense?
What I can say is based on, again, the Open Skies Treaty regime is producing imagery that's open to all, and they have imaged a number of sites around the country.
Does possible surveillance of U.S. national critical infrastructure fit with Russia's warfighting doctrine?
Well, sir, I would say that under the Open Skies Treaty, we are all basically opening up our territory so that the other countries can have a chance to overfly and observe, what's going on in the countries. That was the original idea behind President Eisenhower's proposal of the treaty back in the late 1950s, that it would permit predictability and confidence building among all the parties to the treaty. So it's been very valuable from that perspective.
So a lot of technological advancements have happened since Eisenhower was president. Will the administration permit Russia to fly over the United States with a new advanced digital electro-optical sensor?
Well, sir, the digital sensors that are permitted under the Open Skies Treaty are permitted to all parties to the treaty.
So will the
United States
administration permit Russia to fly over the United States with a new advanced digital electro-optical sensor?
As I said, sir, digital sensors are permitted to all treaty parties, not
So the
only to
answer is
Russia,
yes?
the United States and our European allies and partners, to all treaty parties.
Would information on U.S. national critical infrastructure facilitate targeting of that infrastructure with a Russian cruise missile, for example?
I think it's worthwhile considering, sir, in this context, what increment of information the Russian Federation receives from the Open Skies Treaty to all the other sources of information that they have, including their national
So you're
technical
suggesting
needs.
that maybe we don't need it anymore?
No, sir, I'm not. I'm suggesting
That it's not of value?
I'm suggesting that you need to look at the incremental value of the treaty in particular settings. I can say it has been of enormous value over eastern Ukraine in that setting in this current crisis. And it's important, again, to bear in mind the importance that our allies and partners place upon this treaty, and to make a good calculation of what particular risks, predictability, and openness have for our national security. We judge that this treaty does not pose such risks to our national security.
Regarding our allies that you mentioned, to the extent that allies value the imagery that they collect from Open Skies, has the administration assessed what commercial imagery the United States could provide to allies without exposing us to the risk of Russian aircraft with Russian sensors being allowed to overfly the United States? What other could we provide our allies using other sources, other methods to our allies that do not include us having to give up overflight rights of the United States?
Well, I think it's a good point, sir, to underscore that a lot is available on commercial imagery now to everyone, every country around the world, whether it's the Russian Federation, our allies and partners. What is valuable, again, about the Open Skies Treaty is that every image is taken by any plane flying by any party over any territory, is that all parties have it available to them. And for that reason, we know exactly what is being gained by overflights of our territory.
Last question in my last few seconds. Have you asked the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency for their analysis on this?
Sir, again, I think this is the kind of discussion that would be good to have if you wish to pursue it in our closed session.
Roger. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes.
"60 times we've gone through this, and still I'm not sure we really recognize the long history of these treaties, compliance and non-compliance over a long, long period of time, dating back to Ronald Reagan, and the question of enforcement at that time of the treaties. And so we've gone back and forth. There really has been a tit for tat over these maybe almost 40 years now. But the bottom line is significant progress has been made, a very, very significant reduction in nuclear weapons, warheads, as well as delivery systems. And while this INF issue is a big one, it is not the only one. And Mr. McKeon, I'm taken by your testimony. And
In a good way, I hope.
frankly, it is a testimony that basically says, we're going to go at this in a very aggressive way. And I'm looking here at Russia does not obtain a significant military advantage from its INF violation. And then you go on to discuss how we can do that. Would you like to elaborate a bit on how we can be assured that they do not have a significant military advantage from their INF violation?
Congressman, as I explained in my opening statement, and there's a longer statement for the record, we're looking at the challenge posed by Russia's military modernization and its activities in Europe, including the INF violation as a whole, and looking at as a department as to what investments we're already making, what new investments we will need to make in the coming years to come to grips with that challenge. I would characterize it as aggressive, but prudent planning in response to what we see in terms of Russian capability, Russian intent.
New unmanned, this is from your testimony, new unmanned systems, new long-range bomber, new long-range cruise, standoff cruise missile, a number of innovative things, including the B-61 bomb, life extension programs, and on and on. Bottom line, are we at a disadvantage vis-a-vis Russia with our military standing today?
Congressman, we still have the most capable military on the planet.
And these additional investments would make us even more so?
We need to keep pace with the modernization of both Russia and China and militaries of both countries. As we look around the globe, those are the two peer or near-peer competitors. And as I said, we see capability on the part of Russia that is growing, as well as the Chinese. It's hard to measure President Putin's intent, but we have seen some of his actions in Europe, so we can.
There's an interesting line in one of your testimonies, I'll ask this question to both of you, that Russia thinks that we have violated the INF. Could you quickly tell us what Russia thinks we have done that violates it?
Yes, when we met with them in Moscow a year ago, September, we went through this in some detail. A couple of things that they raised. One, they complain about our armed, unmanned aerial vehicles, saying that they violate the terms of the treaty. Secondly, they claim that our Aegis Ashore capability, which we're putting in place under the European phased adaptive approach.
That would be both
to Europe.
Romania and Poland?
The one in Romania is essentially nearing completion and will reach operational capability later this year and IOC next year. And
how
then
can
Poland is a couple years away.
That's an anti-missile system. How can that be considered to be anything but?
Their claim, which we have rebutted, is that it's simply a Tomahawk cruise missile system set off that's not on a ship but is on land and can be postured to fire cruise missiles
Are they right?
in their direction. They're not right.
Why?
It doesn't have all the same capabilities and fire control system that you see on a Tomahawk set up on a Navy ship.
How long did it take Ronald Reagan to get the ABM, get Russia back in compliance with the ABM?
I believe it was 7 or 8 years. It's sometime in the mid-'80s where we identified the Krasnoyarsk radar as a violation, and it was worked through to the end of the Reagan administration, then into the first Bush administration before, in negotiations, it was before the Soviet Union collapsed, I think it was in 1989, in conversations between Secretary Baker and then Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, where they came to an agreement on
When did the United States withdraw from the ABM Treaty?
2001 or 2002 under President Bush.
Is that a unilateral withdrawal?
It was, yes, sir.
Thank you. Yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Perry for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gottmiller, or Secretary Gottmiller, about a year ago, as I recall, we had a very similar hearing to this one. And you enumerated, and through the course of the conversation, we came to an understanding of the alleged violations. And I think at that time we kind of realized or kind of confirmed that it took years. I mean, administration knew years passed at that point that the violations had been made, but we hadn't been made aware of them. And at that time, I asked you very specifically what was going to be done, what was the panoply of options that might be available to us. And I think we reserved that for an executive session. But I'm wondering at this point, because it's also my understanding that by now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs has offered a series of options to remedy the situation, to bring Russia back into compliance. Is there any plan to implement any of them? And if there is a plan, is it available to be heard in open session?
Well, Congressman, I've laid out in my opening statement our overall response to Russia's behavior, including this INF violation. There's more that I can say in closed session about some measures we are going to undertake in partnership with our NATO allies.
Is there a plan to implement it, though? Is there? I know there are options, but is there a plan to implement it with a timeline? The administration seems to be happy to give our adversaries timelines when we'll withdraw from countries in combat, et cetera. Is there a timeline when Russia can expect implementation of this plan?
Sir, there's a number of capabilities that we're investing in, some of which were already on the books, some of which will be new in the or increased in the FY17 budget and built into the future years defense program. And so it will be a continuing effort, as I said, to respond to what we see in terms of Russia's growing military modernization and its capabilities and its behavior, including its INF violation. So there won't be a specific point where you will say, aha, everything is in place. We're working to counter what we see as the threat posed by Russia's activities, including the INF violation.
So we don't have milestones that we can measure their accountability and their compliance, or their milestones?
Well, sir, I'm outlining for you what the Department of Defense is going to be doing over the coming year and into the future past this administration, assuming these plans are carried forward. We continue to have a separate conversation with Russia about coming into compliance with the treaty. They will see these activities, and they will see them in our budget, and they will start to understand, we believe, that this response is not making them any more secure.
Well, with all due respect, and I'll end my questioning, it seems to me that our response, years and years in the making, without any forced compliance, without any repercussions to failure of compliance, is just going to lead Russia to believe that they can continue to be in noncompliance without any accountability. And that's what I've seen. That's what I learned a year ago, and it doesn't seem to me that much has changed in the year between now and then, with all due respect, without a yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Ms. Kelly for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. McKeon, in your assessment, other than the INF Treaty, are there any arms control obligations that Russia is not complying with or is in violation of treaty agreements with the United States?
Congresswoman, I'd probably defer to Undersecretary Gottemiller, who controls the pen on the compliance report. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty is one of them. We have compliance concerns about other treaties, including the Open Skies Treaty. But
Ma'am, I will only add that as far as the additional treaties. We have longstanding concerns about the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention. We cannot confirm Russian compliance with those treaties because they have not provided, as we believe, full information and data about Soviet-era programs, their past programs before the Soviet Union fell apart. Nevertheless, they are good treaty partners in the Chemical Weapons Convention. They are continuing to destroy tons and tons of Soviet-era chemical weapons and are doing so according to an agreed schedule. So, and they're working with us in Syria to bring to final conclusion Syria's destruction, elimination of its chemical weapons arsenal.
Where they're not good partners, what are we doing about that?
Where they are not good partners, in my world, we are continuing to make sure that they are aware that they must come back into compliance with the INF Treaty specifically, that is in their interest as well as for the rest of the international community. In the case of the CFE Treaty, we actually took countermeasures inside the treaty context and ceased implementing the treaty with regard to the Russian Federation. But again, the CFE Treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, brings a lot of predictability and mutual confidence to other partners and signatories of the treaty, especially during this period of crisis, not only in Ukraine, but in other places such as Georgia and so forth. So it is helpful to continue to ensure that information is flowing, that inspections take place, and notifications of activities are flowing.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Ms. Gottmuller, I understand that Ambassador Thomas Graham has suggested publicly that the administration is looking to circumvent the Constitution and allow or actually pursue a prohibition of nuclear testing through a UN Security Council resolution. I obviously would recoil at any Security Council dictating American defense policy. Can you assure this committee that the administration is not pursuing this idea?
Sir, I have been in constant battle with our NGO colleagues over this issue. We do not agree with this notion.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. And you're assuring me that that's not being pursued?
Correct.
Okay, that's good. See, answers can happen. Knowing that since the 1996 era, 3 countries have broken the de facto comprehensive nuclear test ban moratorium and tested nuclear weapons. That's India and Pakistan in 1998, and then North Korea in 2006 and 2009, and again in 2013. Your compliance report this year states that each state with a testing moratorium complied with it in 2014. So is it, in other words, is it correct now to state that no state last year conducted a nuclear weapons test that produced a nuclear yield?
Sir, within this century, the only state that has tested nuclear weapons is, that in a way that produced a nuclear yield, is North Korea. So since the beginning of...
So you're saying India and Pakistan in 1998, that did not occur?
No, sir, since 2000 is what I'm saying.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The only state that has tested to nuclear yield is North Korea.
And so no state last year conducted any nuclear yield test or any test that resulted in a nuclear yield?
Correct.
All right. Well, listen, that's all the questions I have, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair, I recognize Mr. Fleming for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For both of our panelists today, I would like to ask this question. You both mentioned in your testimony that the administration continues to reiterate to Russia its need to come into compliance with the INF Treaty. Do you have any specific details of actions taken by Russia to suggest that Russia actually intends to come into compliance with the INF, that the administration's urgings are having any effect?
Sir, what I can say is that the Russian Federation claims that it is in full compliance with the treaty. It does not acknowledge this violation that we have regularly expressed grave concerns to it about. It does not acknowledge the missile, the ground-launched cruise missile. So it claims it's in compliance with the treaty, number one, and it also, in that context, asserts its commitment to continue for the present time to stay in the INF treaty. And so that is the position that we hear from the Russians time and time again.
I assume you confront them with the actual data. How do they respond when you actually show it to them?
I have told them, that they have received from us sufficient information to be able to determine what missile we are talking about, but they claim that they cannot tell what missile we are talking about.
Do you feel like that their unwillingness to comply with INF may actually get worse? They may actually continue in the wrong direction?
Well, one, I think, benefit of calling them out on their violation of the INF Treaty is that they are aware that the world is watching very closely, and that we are watching very closely their continued behavior with regard to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. So I do believe that it is having an effect upon them.
Mm-hmm. Has the U.S. implemented any economic sanctions because of their failure to comply with INF?
We have been working with our allies to consider economic sanctions, and you're aware, sir, that we have imposed a wide range of economic sanctions in complete agreement with the European Union to respond to their incursion into Crimea. And that, I think, has been extraordinarily effective. We continue to consider economic measures with regard to the INF Treaty, but up to this point, we have not pursued
When you say effective, what's the metric for that? How do you know that's being effective?
Well, I think effective is, in the case of economic sanctions, it's clear that it is having an economic impact.
It's hurting their economy, you're saying?
Right.
Is that mostly in the oil and gas type of venue, or is?
Well, when we look across the range of sanctions, and this is a topic that, if you are interested in, deserves a separate briefing, but when we're looking across the range of sanctions undertaken with the EU, it's not only the oil and gas sector, it's manufacturing, it's across the board, really.
Mr. McKeon, you mentioned in a hearing last year that the DoD is examining a range of military options to respond to Russia's INF violations. Congress has moved this process along. This year's NDAA, just signed by the President last week, included language to require the DoD to make plans and begin development of a kind of systems that you outlined in your testimony. What can you tell me about that?
Well, in terms of the report, Congressman, we're aware of the reporting requirement, and we'll endeavor to meet it on time, although I will confess I know we're not always the best at being timely with our reporting because we have a lot of reporting requirements. In terms of the capabilities that we're looking at, I outlined those in some detail in my statement, and I'll go into a little bit more in closed session of some ideas that we're going to pursue in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if the administration's urgings to Russia regarding INF compliance are not changing Russian behavior, we see that it may have some effect on their economy, but not their behavior. And in fact, Russia's behavior may be moving in the opposite direction. Why is the administration delaying other economic and military lines of effort that would actually have an effect on the diplomatic line of effort? For either one or both?
Well, sir, I don't think we are delaying implementation of military measures, and we can talk about that in the closed session. These investments, some of these investments we were going to make, we weren't planning to make if 2 or 3 years ago. They're in response, not just the INF violation, but other Russian activity. In terms of economic measures, I would defer to Rose on that. But if we continue down this course and the measures we are taking do not lead to Russian compliance, we can always assess whether to take other measures.
Okay.
If If I may just very quickly comment, sir, in addition to the points that Mr. McEwen has made about denying Russia any significant military advantage if it persists in its violation of the INF Treaty, so that's at the top of the list, but nevertheless, I do believe that it is important to back diplomacy up with strong action in these other areas.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. McKeon, I want to clarify something, or get clarification on something you just talked about. You're not just required to present a report. Aren't you supposed to start carrying out the responses under 1243?
Mr. Chairman, I will defer to you on what your language says because I've not studied it closely, so I will get back and read it when I get back to the department. I'm generally aware of a list of requirements that you put into the new NDAA, but I will confess I've not read them closely.
Thank you. Chair, I recognize Mr. Turner for any questions he may have for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gottmiller, you were very, very prepared with the question from the ranking member as to how many times you've been here, and I appreciated the quantification of the number of times that you've, and people from your office, as you've said, made themselves available. But I think what you understand is it's not how many times you appear before us, it's what you say. And on the what you say, there's two categories that are important to us. One, action. That's one. What most of our questions to both of you today have been, what are we doing and what is going to happen as a result of the change in the circumstances in the world, or what our non-allies, what Russia is doing. The second is information. It's what do you tell us? If you come before us and you're not telling us the whole story, then it doesn't matter if you're here 170 times. If we don't get the whole story, it's a worthless exchange of dialogue between us. Now, we all know that there's considerable consternation between this administration and this committee on the fact that the administration knew in intelligence information of Russia's violation in 2008 of the INF Treaty and waited till 2014 to announce the violation publicly. And as we all know, as we're going through the critical negotiations of the New START Treaty, that type of information was incredibly important. So, action and information. So, my first question is about information. Ms. Gottmiller, Russia recently has admitted to the disclosure of the existence of a nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered undersea delivery system. It's not really necessarily a missile because it's not coming off of a sub or of a ship. It's its own undersea delivery system. It's not an ICBM because it's not in the air, but it is in effect the same thing. It's only traveling under the water. So back to our two concerns with this dialogue. Ms. Gottmiller, were you aware of the existence of this system when you were in negotiations with the New START Treaty?
Sir, if I may, I'd just like to say the answer to that question is an unequivocal no. But if you want to get into talking about this system in more detail, it's very good to do so in our closed session, and we will be prepared.
Well, I'd be glad to do it in closed session, but one of the great aspects of having this conversation with you, because it's always so much more convenient for us to talk behind closed doors, because the accountability, obviously, isn't as difficult for you, is that this is something that's openly being discussed. I didn't hear of this from a classified briefing from you, where I'm now asking you a question about it. It's in the news, and Russia is admitting, or it's apparently, indicating that it hasn't developing the system. So I want to ask you, though, if you say unequivocally no, that means you didn't know. If you didn't know, should it have been included in the treaty? I mean, is this system a problem when you look at the overall balance that you were trying to accomplish in the New START Treaty?
Well, I think, sir, that it will have to be, considered in the context of where the Russians go with the system.
Well, their intention is to go here, ma'am. I mean, let's be clear.
No,
right? I mean, it's not. They're not going from, one area of Russia to another. Their intent is to go here.
I know we are concerned about it. Of course, we are concerned about it as a threat to the United States. But if it turns into a system that is widely put into operational deployment, that's
widely.
What I meant.
One would probably be sufficiently troubling, right?
I think it is a troubling system, sir.
Okay,
There's
great.
no
So now we're
question
going
about
to
it.
the second aspect of this communication of the over 60 times that you or your staff have been here is action. It's in the public. It's not like no one knows that it's occurring. What have you done? What has the State Department done in communicating to Russia concerning this system? I mean,
I can assure you, sir, that I never hesitate to raise issues of concern.
I didn't ask
including-
if you hesitate.
including
I
about
asked,
this
what did you do?
system, including about this system with my Russian counterparts.
you have. What did you do? Did you?
I never hesitate to raise issues of concern.
What does raise mean? I mean, you're this, Undersecretary of State for International Security. Hey, I saw this in the news.
It makes it clear to them that it is a concern, an official concern of the United States of America.
I think you probably didn't need to tell them that. I think they probably understood it was a concern. Did you tell them anything else about what our official policy was, what action the United States might be taking, what consequences would occur as a result of this being a threat to the United States?
I'll be very happy to talk to you more about this, sir, in close.
I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both the chairmen for having this hearing. Thank you both for being here. I want to dwell a little bit more on what we knew about the INF Russia violating the INF treaty before 2011. That you said just now that that's when you knew for sure that they were in violation. But you had suspicions before 2011, didn't you?
No, sir. As I said, the system could be sea-launched, air-launched, and it is perhaps worthwhile to say that starting in 2011, we had the opportunity to talk to the Hill about it, but we have never, ever kept any information back about this system at all. And I want to assure these two committees of that matter. We have been very upfront and come up here repeatedly to inform you when we knew about this system being not in compliance with the INF Treaty.
When did you first have suspicions?
Sir, I have said it was the end of 2011 when we first had indications that this missile was a missile of concern.
I'm not sure that's my recollection of what we've talked about in earlier hearings. You didn't even have suspicions before 2011?
No, sir.
Let me visit another subject here. You stated recently that the Russians have been pretty good partners over the year, frankly. Yet, you've also said that the Russians are cheating or are not in compliance with the INF Treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, the Open Skies Treaty, the Budapest Memorandum, and other agreements. So with that track record, how can you say they've been frankly pretty good partners over the years?
Sir, I think it makes sense to look at specifically where the partnership has been effective. The list that you just read out is attached to certain nuances, which is very important to understand. They are an outright violation of the INF Treaty and the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. In certain areas, like the Open Skies Treaty, we have what we call compliance concerns, and that is natural in any treaty environment. There are concerns that come up in its implementation, and those are discussed in the implementation bodies of those treaties. We work to resolve them. And so that's why there are some differences here. In the case of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention, actually, we have never been able to confirm the Soviet-era holdings. They've never provided us information on that. But it's in that context I said that they have been a good partner in the Chemical Weapons Convention. They really worked with us to get 1,300 tons of chemical weapons out of Syria, which I'm very glad are no longer in Syria at this moment. We continue to have concerns about what Syria is doing with chemical weapons, and we will continue to wrestle with that problem. But it is in that context that I said the Russians have been a good partner.
Well, in view of all those violations, I guess we have different definitions of what makes a pretty good partner. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair would point out that we've just been called for votes. I apologize. They didn't ask me about when to call them, but we will recess temporarily while we go vote and then reconvene immediately after votes in room 2216. We now stand in recess.